Okay, hello guys. So today we'll be talking on CSS Flexbox. Okay, so basically, sometimes we might want to change the layout of our web page. Okay, so sometimes you have like items stacking on top of each other, but then you want them to stay side by side, or you want to adjust them either to the right or to the center and stuff like that. So CSS Flexbox allows us to do this. So if we have a div, for instance, okay, now, before we start creating our HTML, whatever, there are some rules to this, okay. Now, the Flexbox, in the Flexbox, we have the Flex container and then we have the Flex items. So basically, what the Flex container is the parent element holding other elements, basically. Okay, so let's take for instance now I have a div. Let's just give this guy an ID and then we'll call this, we'll say container. Okay, and then we want to have we want to have three divs here. Okay, or let's say maybe we want to have four divs here. Okay, so for this first div I want to give it an ID of, would say, red. For the second div I want it to have an another ID, would say green. For the third one I want it to have an ID, would say orange. And then for the fourth one I want to give it an ID and then would say pink, like so. Okay, so what we are going to do is that inside of our 10.css here, okay, first off, let's just style this child elements a bit because we need to see what they look like. So the first thing I have to do is to give them width and height. So I'm going to say hash container div, okay, and then we'll say height, and then we'll say maybe 300 px, and then we'll say width, and then we'll say 200 px, like so. Or let's also say 300 px too. Okay, so basically, since we have this, the next thing we want to do is to start giving them like background colors. Okay, now why I'm doing this is so that we'll actually see this element and then see how they behave. But in normal case scenarios, you might not want to do like maybe give your div a height and width and all of, or your flex items rather, height and width. Okay, the only reason why we are doing this is so that we can just see how they are behaving. Okay, then I'm going to say ash red. I'm going to give this a background color of red. Okay, then I would say ash green. I would say background color would say green. I hope we have that there. Yes, then we also have ash orange. Then we'd say background color would say orange, and then would say ash pink, and then this should also have a background color of pink, like so. Okay, so for the most part here, let's save this and see what this look like. I've opened this in my live server and this should look like this exactly. So we just have these four elements. Okay, now they are stacking on top of each other, but like I said, we can use the flex box to change the way these elements are arranged or how they are laid out as. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is, and like I said also, like since we want to affect these children elements or these items, okay, it basically means that we want the flex box, or want to attach the flex on the container element, basically. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down a bit and then I would say hash container, like so. But for my hash container, I want to do something like display flex. Now, once I do this display flex, as you can see, we have these elements now. They are staying side by side, as we can see. Okay, we have these elements staying side by side. Okay. But now, for the most part, we can also use, since we are now displaying the parent element as flex, okay, we can also use we have access to certain properties. Now, one of the properties we have access to is called the flex direction. And what this flex direction does is that it allows us to change the way these flex items are laid out as. So for instance, I think the default is, let's see, column. Okay, sorry, the default is row. Okay, the default is row. Like once you say row, but by default, if immediately you just do display flex, by default the flex direction would be row. Okay, but now we can also change this guy and then make them to stay as columns. So if we want to do that, we can say flex direction, we can say column, and then they'll now stack on top of each other, as we can see. Now, optionally too, we can also say flex direction and then say column reverse. And what this is going to do is that it's going to reverse, or let's say row reverse rather. Okay, let's do row reverse. Okay. Now, just to now once you say row reverse, okay, it's going to reverse the way the elements are. So if I save this now if you look at this, you see that initially we have red, green, orange, and then pink. But now we have it in reverse. Okay, pink, orange, green, and red. Okay, and that is because of the flex direction row reverse. And also we have the same thing too for the column reverse. So we can say flex direction, then we can say column reverse, and then this is going to reverse. So instead of us to have red, green, orange, pink as we had initially, now we have pink, orange, but then like their directions are also reversed. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to just keep this as flex direction and then I would say row, like so, so that like everything stays side by side. Okay, but I think what I want to do is I want to like try and reduce the width of this. I'm going to say 200. Okay, yeah, so 200, so that because the next stuff we want to do now, like I have to reduce so that we'll actually start seeing the effect. But we can even say 150 just to make everything like really small. Yes, I think 150 is perfect. So what we want to do next is now, once we have this flex, okay, we can also use, we have access to the justify content, which allows us to change the direction, okay, of this element on the x-axis. So by default, this element to start from the left, but we can decide to push them to the center or to the right. Okay, so what we can do is we can say justify content. So this is the property that allows us to move elements, okay, on the x-axis, but you can only access this once you've displayed your parent element as flex. So we can say justify content, and then if I say center, for instance, you should see that these elements, they are being taken to the center. And then also if I say justify content again and then I say right or end, for instance, or let's say right, okay, and you should also take it to the right, as you can see. Okay, yeah, so sometimes the right and the end basically means the same thing, or the start and then the left would also mean the same thing. Okay, yeah, but that is for the for those guys. Now we can also do something like justify content and say space around. And what this is going to do is, as we can see, is going to create space in between these items and also around these items, as we can see. Okay, so yeah, so this is now all of these are, we're actually getting access to this because of the display flex that we had initially. Without the display flex, we cannot do this. Okay, so yeah, so the flex around gives spaces around the element and also in between them. Now we also have another one called the justifying content, space between. And once we save this, you should see that we only have space in between these elements, as we can see. Okay, and then lastly we have the justify content, and then we have the space evenly. Now the space evenly, okay, would give equal amount of the space around the element and also in between them, basically. So that is for the space evenly. The space around would give space around the element, but it will not be the same as the space in between them. While the justify content space between would only give spaces in between the elements, and then the space evenly will actually give space, like the same number of space around the element and also around the items, rather, not element, around the flex items and also in between them. So yeah, now the next one I want to look at is the flex, no, no, the align items. Okay, now the align items allows us to just to align content or move content on the y-axis, which is the top, middle, and bottom axis. Okay. Now, for us to actually do this, if I give this element a background color of black, okay, now the problem, like what we have now, is that the height of the container is also the same as the height of the flex items. So for us to actually see changes when we move either to the top, bottom, and wherever, we have to increase the height a bit. So I'm going to say height and then say 100 VH. But like I said, normally you might not want to like do this, like all these height background color thing we are doing. Like you don't only want to, we're only doing this because of just to show us how this element will behave for each property. Okay. So yeah. Now the next thing we might want to do is, now like I said, the align items allows us to move elements on the y-axis, which is the top and bottom. So we can move these elements to the center and also to like the bottom and stuff like that. So I'm also going to reduce the height of this. So let's also say 150 px. Sorry, I'm supposed to do this initially, but yeah. Okay. So yeah. Now what I can do is I can scroll down and then say something like align items, and then we can say, if I say end for instance, and then I say this, you should see that it have taken these items to the bottom, okay, of its parent container, of the flex container rather. Okay. Yeah, so that is basically for that. And then we also have align items, and then we have center, and this should just take it to the center for us. Okay. Now a quick fix would be, or a quick yeah, quick fix basically, okay, would be, sometimes you might want to have your items aligned at the center, both on the horizontal axis and also at the vertical axis. So what you just do for that is you just say justify content, okay, center, and to take it to the center on the x-axis. And then we can also say justify content center, align items rather center, and to take it to the center on the y-axis. Okay. So yeah, so that is for the justify align items. And then there's also align items too. We can also say flex start. Okay. We can also say flex start, or we can also say start too and stuff like that. So to just take it to the top. Now for the most part, some values here would actually behave the same way as other values. So for instance, if I say align items flex end for instance, now you should see that this is also doing the same thing that the end, okay, is also doing. Okay, so yeah, but that is basically for that. Okay. So something else I want to talk about now is going to be but let me take this back to like, let me take this back to the, so I can say, let me just take this back to the start. Okay. So yeah, I'll comment that out. So yeah, so that should start the start. Now I want to look at how we can also give space, okay, on these elements here, on these items. Okay. Now basically, sometimes these spaces are defined by our browser, but like as you can see, the space in between these guys are defined by our browser. But sometimes you might want to give this space, maybe you want this space to be smaller or bigger, or just like you want to have custom space. So what you can do is that you can actually use the column gap property or the row gap property for that. Okay. So yeah, so for instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just say justify, because now we already have this space, and we might not like really see the differences when we start adding like the gap. So I'm going to just say justify content, and then I'm going to say center here. Okay, yeah, so everything just becomes together. But now let's say we wanted to have space, okay, we want to have space, okay, on these guys or in between these guys. We can use the column gap. Okay. Now, if I say 50px for instance and say this, you see that we have control over the number of space that we want to have in between these elements. Or we can even say, we can just say that 10 or 20 or whatever. But now with the column gap, we can now specify like the number of space that we want on this element or in between this element. Okay, that is one. Now we also have the row gap. Okay. And now the row gap, like I said, okay, now the row gap would actually give this element space if we had another element at the, or other elements at the bottom, like so. Okay. So but since you don't have any element at the bottom, we might not be able to see this, but just know that the column gap is actually on the x-axis while the row gap is going to be on the y-axis basically. Okay, so yeah. And now I'm going to just, yeah, but we have a shorthand for this, for the column gap and the row gap, and that is the gap property. Now what this gap is going to do is that it's like a shorthand for both the column gap and the row gap. So instead of us to start writing these guys individually, we can just write them inside of one property. Now if I say something like 50px, what this means is that we want 50px of space on both our column gap and then our rows. Okay, so yeah, so once we have one value here, it's going to affect both the column gap and then the row gap. But then let's say maybe you want to have a different value for both the row gap and then the column gap. What we can do is you can say gap, and then if I say, I can say, okay, for the row gap I want 50 pixel, and then for the column gap I want 100 pixel. Now this, once you have two values here, the first value affects the row gap while the second value affects the column gap. Now if I save this, you should see that we're having more space on the column. Now if I try to increase this from 100 to 200, I should see that like we are still having extra spaces. Okay, okay, yeah, so that is basically for the gap. Okay, now something else we should also know is that now, no matter how much items we add inside of here, okay, by default, the display flex will try to put everything inside of one row by default. Okay, so it will try to, so even if, for instance, now if I come here and then I try to increase this to like, let's say 400px, for instance. Okay, now they're increasing, but like it will just try to maintain, like even if I say something like 1000px, like you see that all these items, they are still staying inside of one row. Okay, but now let's say, because sometimes you might not want to have this, like you might want, like if a particular item size cannot stay on this one row, you should send it to the next row. So now that is what the flex wrap is meant for. So if I say flex wrap and then I say wrap, for instance, what this basically means is that if a particular flex item cannot stay on one row as other items, maybe because of its size, then send it to the next row. So once I save this and then I come back, now if you look at this now, you should see that we have these two items on separate on separate rows. Now the reason for this space that we have here is because of that row gap that we had initially. Now if I say, and I think also now if I try to reduce this a bit, like 10 pixel, you should just keep like reducing and stuff. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so yeah, so that's for the flex wrap. Okay, flex wrap basically allows us to send items to the other row. Now look at this. If I try to increase this, let's say if I do this to, let's say, 50%. Okay, now you should see that because we cannot have two items staying on 50% here, that is why it's sending them to the next line. But if I say, let's say 10%, you see, okay, now this is 10%, 20%, 30%, and 40%. But if I say 25%, let's see, okay, you see that it's only, it will say 25, 50, and then 75. But like this guy now cannot also stay here. That's why I'm sending it to the next line. Okay, so that is for the flex wrap. Okay, so yeah, so I think we are going to stop here. But this